February 15th, 1942, Singapore, the Malayan Peninsula, the largest British military garrison in Asia, defended by over 85,000 Allied troops, surrendered to a Japanese force half its size. It was the greatest military catastrophe in British history. General Arthur Percival walked out beneath a white flag and handed Japan the keys to Britain's most important strategic base in the Pacific. In Canberra, Australian Prime Minister John Curtin delivered a radio address the following morning. His words were unambiguous. He said the fall of Singapore opened the battle for Australia. He said that on its outcome depended not merely the fate of the Commonwealth, but the frontier of the United States of America. Curtin knew something he did not say on the radio, but which his generals understood with perfect clarity. The supply lines from Britain were gone. Every vehicle, every tank, every piece of armoured equipment Australia had depended on from British factories was now unreachable. The Japanese Navy controlled the sea routes. The Japanese army was moving south. And Australia, a continent of 7 million people staring into the barrel of the most aggressive military expansion in Pacific history, had almost nothing to fight with. In 1940, the entire armoured inventory of the Australian Army amounted to roughly 10 Vickers light tanks, 4 obsolete Vickers medium tanks, and a handful of imported tracked carriers. There were no Australian armoured vehicles. There were no Australian armoured factories. There was no Australian armoured industry. It looked like an impossible situation, a nation being asked to manufacture weapon systems it had never built, at speed, under threat of invasion, using factories designed for peacetime production. What Australia built in response would go on to serve on 3 continents. It would equip 6 frontline divisions. It would fight in the Western Desert, the jungles of New Guinea, and the river valleys of Borneo. Roughly 5,000 would be produced, and the factories that built it would lay the foundation for an Australian defence manufacturing industry that still exists today. Its designation was the Carrier Machine Gun, Local Pattern No. 2. The Australian Army called it the LP2, and it was the first armoured fighting vehicle Australia ever mass-produced. To understand why the LP2 existed, you need to understand what Australia's strategic position actually was in the years before the Pacific War began. Through the 1920s and 30s, Australian defence policy rested entirely on the Singapore strategy. The assumption was that a powerful Royal Navy fleet based at Singapore would shield Australia from any threat emerging from Asia or the Pacific. Australia did not need a large independent military capability. Britain would provide. The Empire would protect its dominions. This assumption shaped everything. The Australian militia and the part-time citizen army shrank from 127,000 men in 1922 to fewer than 37,000. Investment in armoured vehicles, artillery and heavy equipment was minimal. There was no industrial base for it. There was no perceived need for one. The vehicle Australia had imported in small numbers was the British Universal Carrier. It traced its lineage to 1930s Vickers designs, refined through experimental work by a British engineer named John Carden in the 1920s. By 1940, the Universal Carrier had become the standard British light-tracked vehicle across all theatres. It was open-topped. It carried a crew of 2 to 5. It was powered by a Ford V8 engine producing roughly 85 horsepower. It weighed approximately 3.75 tons. Its armour ranged from 7 to 12 millimetres. It could reach speeds of approximately 48 kilometres per hour. It was never designed to be a tank. It was a weapons platform, a supply vehicle, a reconnaissance tool. It carried a Bren gun, or a Vickers medium machine gun. It moved ammunition forward. It towed anti-tank guns into position. In the right circumstances with the right crew, it was extraordinarily useful. In the wrong circumstances, it was a death trap. Australia had imported enough examples to study the design. When the supply lines closed, Australian engineers did not wait for permission. They began copying it immediately. The first attempt, designated the LP1, began in 1940 at the Victorian Railway's Newport workshops in Melbourne. Engineers worked from a single imported Bren Carrier No. 2, Mark I. They reverse-engineered it, adapted it for local construction methods, and built 160 examples using riveted construction, because that was what Newport's machinery could initially produce. The LP1 was a starting point, not a finished product. Australian engineers identified problems almost immediately. The riveted construction was time-consuming. The design needed adaptation for the heat, the humidity, and the terrain of the Pacific. The LP2 followed quickly. The LP2 used welded construction throughout. Australian engineers at the Broken Hill Proprietary Company, working under a metallurgist named Bishop, developed a locally produced armour steel designated Australian Bulletproof Plate No. 3 ABP3. It matched the protection standard of British rolled homogeneous armour. It could be welded on Australian manufacturing lines. It did not need to be imported. The hull itself was modified. The glacis plate, the angled front armour, was given a steeper slope than the British original. A longer, higher air scoop was fitted above the engine compartment to combat the overheating problems that afflicted the original Ford V8 in tropical conditions. The steering system was refined. The LP2 used a 1938 type Ford rear axle. A subsequent variant, the LP2A, used the 1940 type axle, which was more robust under sustained operational use. These two subtypes look nearly identical from a distance. Mechanically, they are distinct vehicles. The Canadian-built Ford 239 cubic-inch side valve V8 engine, the same basic power plant as the British original, was retained. It was the one major component that could not yet be manufactured domestically at scale. Everything else, the hull, the armour, the running gear, the tools, the stowage, was Australian. Production was organised across 5 facilities in 4 states. The Victorian Railway's Newport Workshops in Melbourne acted as the primary coordinating contractor, supported by 644 subcontracting firms. The South Australian Railway's Islington Workshops ran a parallel production line. The Metropolitan Gas Company's Fitzroy facility in Victoria contributed carrier production alongside its regular industrial work. Ford Motor Company's Homebush plant in New South Wales joined the programme. From 1943, the State Engineering Works in North Fremantle, Western Australia, added further capacity. According to the Official Australian History of Wartime Industry, written by David Philip Mellor, the Newport Workshops produced 4,023 machine gun carriers, together with spare parts for a further 5,583. The Islington Workshops produced an additional 1,560. Total local pattern carrier production, across all marks and variants, reached approximately 5,000 to 5,600, depending on how specialist derivatives are counted. These figures should be understood as representing the best available official record. Some secondary sources cite slightly different totals reflecting different counting methodologies. These were not small numbers.